Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Philly Factor. I'm Paul Perillo. 50 years ago, in a studio about a third the size of the studio that we're sitting in right here, a local television show went national. And it went on the ABC network, and it literally put Philadelphia on the map when it came to music, fashion, and dance. If a recording artist appeared on Bandstand, it was virtually assured that he or she would their career would be a success, and they would go on to bigger and better things. Many people, including Philadelphia's own Bobby Rydell, Connie Francis, Chubby Checker, all appeared on Bandstand. Dozens more also appeared on the program. It created stars also out of many of the dancers who appeared on Bandstand as the show went national. American Bandstand on the air from Philadelphia 50 years ago, and here to talk about the significance and the impact that Bandstand has had on our society is Tommy McCarthy, music director for WOGL 98.1 FM in Philadelphia. Tommy, thanks for spending some time with us.
Hey, my pleasure. Great to be here, Paul.
Good
How you
to see
doing?
you. I'm doing fine.
Good.
Many people would say, well, of course, Bandstand has sort of always been there on the air for more than 30 years. Right. But it started out as a local television show.
Yes, it was. It was a local television show here on Channel 6, WFIL TV at the time, which is now WPVI. But in those days, Bob Horn was the original host, and Bob Horn also did a radio show on WFIL AM Radio 560. And he was the first one who came on the air with a dance premise. Now, he really got the idea for that show from two local disc jockeys known as Grady and Hurst, who were on 950 AM WPEN. What happened was Grady and Hurst, when 950 WPEN was in downtown Philadelphia, Center City, they had a big area in their radio studio, and they would play the pop records of the day. In those days, this was pre-rock and roll now, you have to remember. I'm talking Patti Page, Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole music. Sure. But the teenagers were still dancing to that music, much like their parents did in those days before the explosion of rock and roll. And Grady and Hurst teenagers to come up to their radio show, given this was not seen on camera, but they would dance to the songs that Grady and Hurst were playing. Now, Bob Horn, who was a friend of those, it was a very small broadcasting community in those days. Everybody knew one another. So they were friendly. So Bob Horn, who was at WFIL and had the access to television from radio to make the jump, he convinced the people at WFIL TV to give him a shot of doing that format on television. And that's really where it began. And from 1952 until 1956, Bob Horn was the original host of Bandstand, as it was called then, a local show, and the biggest show on daytime television in Philadelphia at that time. You remember there weren't a lot of soap operas yet or game shows in those very early days of television. In fact, there were times that TV didn't even come on until late morning and sometimes until mid-afternoon. There wasn't that much programming. So they were looking for shows to fill the time. And that's why Bandstand was a 2.5-hour show, which is unheard of in those days, because it was to fill a gap that they needed in local broadcasting at that time. And in July of 1956, Bob Horn stepped down and Dick Clark was made the new host of Bandstand, still Bandstand in those days, because Dick Clark was also a disc jockey on WFIL Radio 560 AM. So he came on as the local host of Bandstand. Now, he knew he had a winner, but Tony Mammarello, who was the producer in those days, really was even picking the music for Dick Clark. Dick Clark, who came from that Patti Page, Perry Como era, that was really the music that Dick Clark liked, knew, and enjoyed. Rock and roll, as it was emerging, was not really something his ear was attuned to. So when he took over as the host of Bandstand, Tony Mammarella, the producer, said, "Don't worry, we'll still pick the music. You're just going to go out there and be the great host that you will become and are right now even, and just present it to the kids. You're going to be like the teenagers' older brother." That's exactly the premise and the reason why he got the show, because Bob Horn looked a little older. He was more like your uncle. And they were looking for a younger image to come along. And Dick Clark was, even though he was 26 years old, he looked about 19 at the time.
And Dick has always had this persona of always being America's oldest
living teenager.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Right.
So he hosts Bandstand, and then at some point convinces
Right.
the ABC television network to
What
pick
he
up the
does,
show?
exactly, because back if you know the history of broadcasting in those days in television, ABC was like the baby network. It didn't have as many affiliates as the two majors. The two majors in those days were CBS and NBC. Those were the giants. Those were the ones who had the major stars with television shows like Bob Hope and Frank Sinatra and Dinah Shore. They were all on those networks. ABC was like a fledgling network, and Dick knew that, and he knew they were hungry for programming. So he and Tony Mammarella would take the train from 30th Street Station up to New York on a weekly basis with tapes of the shows, ratings from the shows to show how popular it was in Philadelphia, showing them the fan mail that came in. Because back in those days, fan mail had a lot to do with where ratings took the place later on.
Sure.
They were getting thousands of letters a week in fan mail to these dancers on who you would think unknown kids,
Right.
people like Arlene Sullivan and Kenny Rossi and Frank Spagnola, all these people who were the dancers in those days, Justine and Bob, were becoming stars in their own right. When they would go to record hops, the thousands of kids would show up to these record hops once it was announced ahead of time just to see these kids because they watched them every afternoon in their living room. So Tony Mammarella and Dick Clark would go to New York every week and try to convince ABC. Finally, in the summer of 1957, almost after a year of going up there and trying to pitch the show, ABC said, okay, look, in August we're going to give you 4 weeks. Starting August the 5th of 1957, we're going to put you on the network, and we're going to give you 4 weeks. If it doesn't make it in 4 weeks, at least when September comes along and the season really begins, the TV season, we'll be able to yank you and put a better show on, a soap opera, whatever, because this was daytime TV. So Dick Clark, the genius that he was in marketing and programming, knew that. So within 2 weeks, so when it went on in August the 5th of 57, they changed the name from Bandstand to American Bandstand because it was now a national show. So in 2 weeks of that 4-week run, it was now the #1 daytime show on the ABC television network. So hands up, that was it. And from like you said, 30 years later, it was still on until eventually it was dropped. It was a daily show until 1963. 1963, Dick Clark moves the show from Philadelphia to Los Angeles, and it becomes a Saturday show. The ratings, were starting to drop. The biggest years for American Bandstand when it went on in August of 57 were 1958, 1959, 1960 into 61. 62, the daily ratings, some of the soap operas and game shows now that were coming along were starting to have larger ratings. So ABC was looking to put either a game show or a soap opera on, and they moved American Bandstand to a Saturday show, and it continued on Saturdays until the end.
And as I mentioned that, and sort of being at the celebration back in August for the 50th anniversary of Bandstand, and talking to many of the, not only many of the people behind the scenes, but some of the artists that appeared on Bandstand, Connie Francis and Chubby Checker, that they said that if your record got played on Bandstand, you were virtually assured a career in this industry.
Well, pretty much. There were a lot of one-hit wonders who did appear on Bandstand, getting the writing talents behind you, because long before the Beatles came along and people like Buddy Holly, in the 50s, Buddy Holly and Paul Anka and Neil Sedaka are the only 3 artists that stand out in my mind who wrote their own material. The Beatles and the Stones kind of changed all that when the British invasion came along. So the music kind of dried up because all of those artists, the Chubby Checkers, the Bobby Rydells, the Frankie Avalons and Fabians, who depended on other musical talents to write their songs, all of a sudden these people said, hey, if the Beatles can write their own songs and be up front, maybe I can do it. So a lot of songwriters who were available at one time, now they try to push their own careers as singers. And of course, most of them didn't make it that way. But the music just changed so much in 1964 with the British invasion and the explosion of the Motown sound that everything really kind of changed for the scene here in Philadelphia. Plus, dance styles were changing. Dick Clark was so much on the curve. Talk about somebody on the curve. When he moved American Bandstand from Philadelphia, think about it, in 1963, That's when the Beach Boys were coming along, Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. But by '64, the dance style, see, the teenagers in Philadelphia were very good with jitterbugs and cha-chas and line dances, kind of a regimented kind of dancing. And that was perfect for that era of music, from 1955, the beginning of the rock and roll explosion. I call the Big Bang Theory of rock and roll in 1955, up until the British invasion of 1964. But by 1964, when you watch the American Bandstand in Los Angeles, you'll see how dance styles totally, with the frug and the monkey and all these crazy dances, you no longer danced as partners anymore. It kind of began with the twist, but by '64, the style of dancing was so different that I almost think that had the show stayed in Philadelphia, it may not have lasted as long as it did, oddly enough. As much as I love the show much more when I watch the old kidoscopes of it here in Philadelphia, but the mood of dancing was like the go-go style, you know what I mean? So the LA people were perfect for that, where the Philadelphia audience wouldn't have moved on that way.
And I'm guessing that many people, even in the control room here, you mentioned some of these dances, they're thinking, what is he talking about?
Right.
But, you know, that was society. That's what the kids were doing back in the 50s and then, you know, in the early 60s. And then the show shifts to, you know, to California. Right. And it's on the air through a good part of the 80s before it is ultimately dropped. Right. And then actually leaves ABC and then goes to one of the cable.
Goes to the USA network, right. It was there until '89. It was on the air until 1989. But in the early 80s, it was dropped. Everybody who was anybody appeared on American Bandstand of the major artists through the 1980s.
Except there are some, you know, okay, so you heard what Tommy said, that everybody who was anybody appeared on American Bandstand. But even having talked to Dick Clark and interviewing him a number of years ago, you know, there were three that stand out that sort of appeared but never really appeared on his program.
Right. Well, the main one, of course, was Elvis. As big as Elvis was, the Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, would not let Elvis go on for scale. And that's what Bandstand was playing, even as a national show. Because you remember when Elvis went on the Ed Sullivan Show, he was paid $50,000 for 3 appearances, an unheard of amount. Because in those days, scale for a national show, the Ed Sullivan Show in particular, was $7,500 an appearance. Elvis got $50,000 for 3 appearances. So Bandstand was not going to get Elvis. Now, when Elvis came through Philadelphia the very first time was in March of 1957. At that time, All Shook Up was the #1 record in the country, and that was his current record. And he appeared long before the Spectrum was the big venue for concerts in Philadelphia, was the Arena, which was right next door at 45th and Market Streets to American Bandstand. Now, Dick Clark was the host of the Elvis show that Friday night, and a local disc jockey, High Lit, was the host on the Saturday night show of that venue. But the Colonel would not let Elvis come on the show. The other one in that era was Ricky Nelson, and the reason Ricky Nelson was not on the show because his father, Ozzie Nelson, who was the guiding his career, not as a manager, but really as a guidance for him of what to do. Every week, of course, you remember the Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet on television. Well, at the end of those shows, Ricky would always sing his latest hit single. So Ozzie, wisely enough, felt it would be like an overexposure kind of a thing. Ricky didn't need to come to Philadelphia to be on American Bandstand to sing his latest hit when he's going to sing it on, I think, like Wednesday nights or Thursday night, whenever Ozzie and Harriet was on. So that was the second artist. Then the third and final artist, where everyone else from Madonna to Michael Jackson to the Jackson 5 to you name it, were on American Bandstand. And the Rolling Stones were on American Bandstand, all the British groups. The only other exception is the Beatles. The same thing. When they came, by the time they came to our shores, after being on the Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964, they were way too big, again, even though it was a national show, to come on for scale and appear in a small studio like that when the mob scene would have just been outrageous. So those are the only 3 artists, major artists or otherwise, who never appeared on American Bandstand, although Dick Clark became friendly with all of those artists, had a lot of Elvis memorabilia, the cape that he wore in the Aloha Hawaii concert. I was out at his studios not long before he had his stroke, actually. About 2 weeks prior to him having his stroke, I was out at his studios in Burbank, California with him, And he showed me all of the memorabilia that he had saved through the years, contracts that Barbra Streisand had written, and various items of Michael Jackson and Madonna, and of course Elvis and the Stones and Bo Diddley, everybody who he had met over the years from all the shows he had hosted. Because, you know, he hosted, aside from Bandstand, the American Music Awards, the Country Music Awards. As a producer behind the scenes, he became much more wealthy, really, as a producer of all these shows than he did even on Bandstand. Yeah. And during those days, he had the Caravan of Stars, which would appear at the old Atlantic City on the Steel Pier. Remember the Steel Pier in Atlantic City? Well, they used to have very big shows there. They had Elsie the Borden cow was down there, and the high diving horse. And here's down there putting on shows. Now, Ricky Nelson actually did appear down there, and at the time, he was the biggest draw in history at the Steel Pier. Prior to that, I believe Frank Sinatra had held that record in the 1940s, appearing there. But in the 1950s, Ricky Nelson, I believe, broke that record when he appeared at the Steel Pier.
It's amazing because many people think of Bandstand, they automatically think of Dick Clark, but Dick's thumbprint, if you will, is really throughout this industry. He owned a number of radio stations at times, and actually his, you think of him as being a television, icon, but his family owned a radio station. That's really where he got his start in the radio industry.
Exactly, a general manager. It was a general manager. His uncle, I believe, owned the station, and his father, I believe, was in sales at the station, because originally he was going to get into sales, because in those smaller markets, the disc jockey didn't really make much money. The salespeople who were making commission off the commercials were making much more money. It wasn't until he came to Philadelphia from New York, where he was from, that he started making money here at WFIL Radio. But he saw the future in the infancy of television, of the power of what television could be, and that's when he wanted to shift his focus and get on television. And the marketing guy that he was. At one time, Dick Clark owned a portion of 33 companies. Now that seems incredible when you think about it. But he had music publishing, he had portions of various record companies, the Swan Record Company, Jamie Guyton Records. He was behind, he made the careers of what you call the golden boys of Bandstand. Bobby Rydell, Frankie Avalon, Fabian, Chubby Checker, are at the highest of the list, and even Connie Francis, as you mentioned, not from Philadelphia. She, of course, was from North Jersey. Started her career at the Brill Building in New York, but she was having no hit records until Dick Clark played Who's Sorry Now on American Bandstand, and that was her first national hit. And then he really got behind her, and they became very big friends. And his closest friend of all the singers was Bobby Darin. He and Bobby Darin, and he also spearheaded Bobby Darin's career, and pushed him along and helped him as well. But the guys from Philadelphia, Frankie and Fabian, admit that American Bandstand, had it not been down at 46th and Market Streets here, they may have wound up working at the Italian market their whole lives, because that was the springboard. That's where you could go. See, to get into Philadelphia, especially during, say, a snowstorm, something of that nature, where artists couldn't come in, even the rail lines were running slow, you needed, and it was live TV in those days, no taping. So you needed to have artists to come in to help fulfill the show, because every day they had 2 to 3 musical acts. When it was a 2.5-hour show, before it was shortened down to an hour national show, they had at least 3 musical acts every day coming in live. So you had to make sure that you were going to have some talent. So the lucky thing was that Cameo Parkway Records was here in Philadelphia. Chancellor Records was based here in Philadelphia. The Swan record label was based here in Philadelphia, as well as Jamie Guyton Records. So there were local artists who lived here in the Delaware Valley, mostly in South Philadelphia, who you could call on a moment's notice and say, hey, so-and-so is snowed in New York, can you come in and sing? And Bobby Rydell would be there in 20 minutes. And so that always would help their careers as well. Same thing with the dancers. They had what was called the committee. These were the dancers who, when school was out in August and July, you would think people would be away on vacation, so they didn't want an empty studio. So these kids that were put on the committee, who became the regulars, who everybody got to know their faces and their names, and they were featured in all the fan magazines, the teen magazines that were out at the time. Some of them even wrote columns in the teen magazines in those days. They were very big stars, but they had to come in even in the dead of summer Even though school was out, they couldn't go away with their family on a vacation.
Yep.
Their commitment to stay on the committee and be in front of that camera all the time was you had to be in that studio in July as well as November when school's back in session, because that's a live show and there's no taping and there's no other way to get around it. We have to make sure there's a certain amount of recognizable faces, because there was always a line outside the studios. If you look at some of the old photos that I have of outside on 46th and Market Street, the line of kids who would, especially in summertime, who would come from Nebraska or Iowa or California, would come in, and that's where they wanted to spend their summer vacation, was to get on Bandstand. That line was around the building, but they were all unrecognizable faces. So Dick didn't want that every day. He would let them in until the studio was full, but at the same time, he wanted that recognizable factor on camera all the time.
It was amazing at the 50th anniversary that they had this party there at 46th and Market, and some people may drive past the building and not even know that that's where, you know, Bandstand was born. And as I said at the outset of the program, that the studio there is probably a third the size of the studio that we're sitting in here. But what was so amazing is that the dance floor, while we see the old programs and we thought the studio was so big, the dance floor was sort of limited. And it's because the cameras were stationary at that time. They couldn't move.
They were very big stationary cameras. They were up on pedestals. There were 3 different cameras with cameramen walking around those. And the dance floor was marked off where the kids, with lines on the floor that you didn't see on TV. So the kids couldn't cross that and become a blur on the screen. If you remember, they had the bleachers. The bleachers would have to be brought down so the kids could fill the bleachers and sit up on the bleachers. Dick's podium was brought out. And I went to American Bandstand one time. It was on my 14th birthday, right before it went to LA. So I'll never forget. And that, too, was one thing that still sticks out in my mind. As many years as I've been back hosting anniversaries there with Dick Clark and corporate events, I've also hosted in that studio, because they still use those studios for corporate events. And myself, Dick Clark put me on the American Bandstand Advisory Board for the American Bandstand Regulars Dancers Association. So we still have annual events there as well. So, but going back to my teenage years at 14 years old, the thing I remember as well is walking in that studio the first time, how small it seemed. It said, well, put on TV. And in those days, you had a black and white 21-inch TV. So the TVs weren't even that big. So when you walked in and saw how small the area was for dancing, because of everything else, the bleachers and Dick's podium that was brought out, the top 10 board, and the area for the staging for the singers to come out and lip sync to their songs, there wasn't even enough room to really bring in a band, band. So either the solo artist or the group who had the hit record would come on and they would lip sync their song. So you didn't have to bring the whole band in and set them up.
In the few minutes that we have left here, and we could go on and talk for hours on end, but before there was TRL, before there was MTV, before there was Soul Train, there was Bandstand. I mean, this really provided the roadmap for all these other shows, and even American Idol to a certain degree today. What do you think the legacy of Bandstand will be? Is what as people look back 50 years from now, even, and they say 100 years ago there was this show. I mean, what is the legacy of Bandstand? Well, as long as there are still access, I wish they would put. I always hoped before Dick passed away that they would do a bio of his life, where he was still around and give some input to it, instead of, say, after he passes, for someone to come along and fix a lot of the things that happened. So the thing with American Bandstand, as time goes on, you really always have to re-educate the younger people, because everybody kind of lives in their own time frame. And it's tough to tell people that American Bandstand really was the MTV of its day. Now, even MTV is fading and isn't really as strong as it was in the 80s and in the 90s. So even that has moved on. So I used to always use that analogy that really struck a chord with people, was American Bandstand to the teen and preteen population and their parents, because back in those days in the 50s and very early 60s, a lot of moms did not have careers. They stayed at home. They were, homemakers. They stayed at home. So even with the moms who watched the show and the preteens and the teenager, the kids could not wait to get home from school and at 3 o'clock to turn that television on, and from 3 to 5 p.m. every day, watch those kids dance. They felt like they knew those kids, and it was a way of life. Like you mentioned at the outset of the show, it taught America how to dance. It taught America how to dress in a lot of cases. The guys always wore blazers and ties. Dick
no jeans, no chewing gum was permitted. The girls had it not too tight of a sweater or skirt when they were dancing. Most of them wore bobby socks and saddle shoes. You know, back in those days, that's the way they dressed, ponytails and all of that. So it was just a simpler time. It was a more innocent time for America, is exactly what it was. It was just a more innocent time in America. To me, it all changed originally with the assassination of President Kennedy. That was like when America kind of lost its innocence.
Sure.
And that's when, like I said, Bandstand at this point is shifting from Philadelphia to the West Coast. The whole thing, music, the country, the mood is all changing. And between that event in November of '63 and February of '64, when the Beatles come on Ed Sullivan's show, we were like in mourning. And when the Beatles came on the Ed Sullivan show in '64, and by that time, Bandstand had just moved, actually the next month, March of '64, went to LA. All of a sudden the music was different, the mood of the country was different. We came kind of out of our mourning period for the president being assassinated, and now there was this new vibrance of youth, you know, in America, even though it was coming from Britain,
Sure.
you know, with the Beatles and the Stones, and then Motown became the new American sound of music. And it all changed in '64, and that's when Bandstand went to LA, and the dance styles changed, and then again, the styles of clothing changed. The teenagers no longer had to wear a jacket and tie. The kids really had more colorful, by that Bandstand, although it wasn't in color yet, it still was a black and white show till I think 1968, believe that or not. That's hard to believe.
Yeah.
But a lot of network shows were still in black and white through the mid to almost late 1960s. I remember when NBC was making a big deal of calling themselves the full color network.
That's right, yeah.
Because a lot of shows weren't all in color at that time. So Bandstand was still in black and white, but Dick Clark was letting the kids change and be more West Coast in their dress, and so the colors were more flamboyant, especially when they went color in like 1968, that all these psychedelic era was coming upon us and all that. So that had all changed. It was much more of loose of a dress code, but exactly the way kids were dressing and dancing in those days.
Well, it has been a fascinating half hour.
It's not over, is it?
It is
Come on.
over. Sorry.
I just started.
And I'm just thinking, you know, as we talk about, you know, just Bandstand being one piece of Philadelphia's contribution to the overall broadcasting industry,
Right.
Let alone the music recording industry and the entertainment industry. We'll have to have you back and sort of, you know, pick up
Right.
where we left off here. But Tommy, I do thank you very much
my
for your
pleasure.
time.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
that very much. Tommy McCarthy, our guest here on the Philly Factor. Of course, Tommy is the music director for WOGL 98.1 FM, and we thank him for his time and his great information about this show that you know, was born here in Philadelphia, went national, and is still very much a fabric of the American entertainment industry and the music scene here in America. My thanks to Tommy McCarthy for being with us on the Philly Factor. Until the next time, have a great time out there. Keep watching. My name is Paul Perello. We do appreciate you viewing us here on the Philly Factor.